the non-ideal theory. I think that ideal theory is valuable even in non-ideal circumstances. You have to think about how it's valuable. I think ideal theory usefully describes an aim or aspiration we might hope to achieve or think about achieving. Also, it's important that ideal theory, like Rawls's, spurs us to think more universally. Rawls is talking about any society that has moderate scarcity and pluralism. He's not just talking about the United States. I think a lot of the people in the United States who focus on racial injustice often end up focusing only on the United States. And of course, there are all sorts of countries with parallel, similar problems. Mills might and did complain that Rawls bought into a kind of sham universality, a universality that wasn't real universality because it was built on the Enlightenment's saying, you know, philosophers of the Enlightenment, especially Kant, saying that all persons must be respected, but what was meant was white persons, effectively, is what Mills says about that. If that's, I mean, I don't think that's what Rawls was saying, but if there's any defect in Rawls's theory in that way, then that should be amended. But that's not the level I'm talking about here. And Tommy Shelby's book, Dark Ghettos, I commend to all of you, as a beautiful way of working together constructively, using premises from ideal theory, Rawlsian ideal theory, to ask and answer questions about what people should do, and various different kinds of people should do in the deeply racially unjust circumstances in which we find ourselves in the United States, and other countries have parallel problems again. So I'm learning what I've today from, or sort of presented to you the thoughts I've come to from learning from Mills's non-ideal theory, as was set out initially in the racial contract, and then of course he kept building on that over years, including the Tanner lecture he gave just in the year before he died, which very vividly set out all the injustices over the last 5 centuries of racism and the colonialism it was connected to. But there's powerful analysis in his work, too, of the dimensions thereof. A Rawlsian who's taken this up is Aaron Kelly, who wrote an article suggesting that a principle of historical redress be connected or added to Rawls's set of principles. I think that's useful, but I think it's not thorough enough because, again, as I say, what Mills convinced me of is that there are defects in Rawls's ideal theory. So let me get to those. But the challenge behind the defects, the question I want to raise is whether the ideal theory is sufficiently resistant to new forms of bigoted oppression arising. And the main worry I have on that score, as I'll illustrate later, is that domination will arise that gives rise to oppression, despite all of the wonderful principles of Rawls's. Just to explain how I'm using these terms, domination and oppression, I'm differentiating the two along the lines that Iris Marion Young does. So domination having to do with social power imbalances that limit some people's ability to have a voice in creating their social conditions. Whereas oppression has to do with how and it could be connected to the domination or result from the domination, but it could have other sources. You get situations where, because of social conditions, people are not able to live good lives. So I'm taking Mills as my inspiration here, and Mills is focused mainly on racial oppression as it's existed over centuries, but I'm talking about the possibility that new forms of bigoted oppression could arise within a Rawlsian well-ordered society, and those could take many forms: racial, ethnic, gender-based, sexual preference-based, whatever, ways in which we haven't even thought of yet, perhaps. To warm you up for my argument about the flaws in Rawls's theory, I want to go over quickly, it's familiar terrain, but the 3 phases of U.S. racial oppression. There was the initial phase where slavery was legally enforced, and then came emancipation and the various aspects to it continuing, as you all know, but in a way the most glaring one is the exception to the 13th Amendment ending of slavery, which is that there was an exception for prisoners. So what did the people do, especially in the South, but all over the U.S. really, is say, well, we need to make these black people prisoners. So they would arrest them on trumped-up charges, throw them in prison, and they would be the chain gangs to do the labor. So they were slaves, in fact, after emancipation. And then, things got better with the civil rights movement, and that affected things at a legal level. But a main thesis that I have here is that the legal level is not enough. And that was the sort of Achilles heel of Rawls's view as he put it out. That in effect we've learned from what's happened in America with racism post-civil rights reforms is that the racism has continued on the basis of informal social norms, whether those are just happening fully informally in socializing or happening in the practices of banks that are doing reverse redlining where they target minority neighborhoods. Well, they target them for loans, so it's reverse redlining. They're saying, oh yes, we have mortgages for you, which is unlike the old redlining, but the mortgages that are targeted to the minority areas have all too often been sort of predatory mortgages on terrible terms that are likely to lead to foreclosure. So the racism continues, and we've seen that, of course, in the violent policing of black males. Now I'm not claiming in my argument that the bigoted oppression that might arise within a Rawlsian well-ordered society would be nearly as bad as any of these phases. I don't know how bad it would be, but I think any bigoted oppression is bad. And I don't know also how to quantify the seriousness of the badness that would arise. Anyway, so I think you'll agree, I think you should agree, that if you have something that's put forward as an ideal society, but it's significantly vulnerable to new forms of bigoted oppression arising, that's a defect in its being an ideal society. And now I need to explain a little bit of Rawlsian terminology. So his term for an ideal society is a well-ordered society, a society that lives up to a certain set of principles of justice and in which people comply with its demands by and large. And notice I said a certain set of principles of justice, so it's indexical, this idea of well-ordered society. It's indexed to different sets of principles. So I've got the name of Rawls's view, of Rawls's principles, is justice as fairness. You have well, by my count, 3 principles of justice as fairness: the principle of equal basic liberties, the principle of fair equality of opportunity, and the difference principle, which governs the distribution of advantages as affected by the basic structure, has to be such that the least well-off do as well as they could. That's the well-ordered society I'm going to be talking about, is a society well-ordered per the principles of Rawls's justice as fairness. Of course, this is just a bit of an aside, but Rawls discusses various different well-ordered societies in a theory of justice to compare, which would be better, a society well-ordered by justice as fairness, or one well-ordered by utilitarianism, or one well-ordered by perfectionism. So you can have a fair selection of principles within his ideal choice situation, the original position. But again, I think this well-ordered society is going to be defective as an ideal if it's vulnerable to structural injustices arising within it. For the sake of argument, I'll assume that the well-ordered society of justice as fairness, which is, it's a hypothetical. There's never existed such a society. But if you started with one, a society that was fully satisfying the principles, I'll assume that that starts without any structural injustice in it currently. And you could think of this concern about bigoted oppression arising as a new layer to Rawls's pioneering idea of thinking about the stability of a well-ordered society. So I think he was the first really to strongly take up that idea that to be ideal, a society had to be one that would stably perpetuate itself. He was focused in that argument on perpetuating itself on the basis of people's conceptions of the good. So it needed to encourage people's conceptions of the good to be shaped in ways that would make the people in the society be supportive of it, follow its principles to a considerable extent. But there's another dimension of support that's needed and needs to be added, which is support coming from social organization of people as shows up in informal norms. So you can take people individually, look at each of their conceptions of the good, but you also need to look at combinations of people and the social norms that combine them. Okay, so I come to the two weaknesses of Rawls's ideal theory and my own weakness with water. So there are two reasons that Rawls's ideal theory is vulnerable in the way I'm worried about here. The first is that his conception of the basic structure is too narrowly legalistic, both in its definition and in the way it's elaborated. Nothing wrong, I have nothing against the law, but I think it's just insufficient for this purpose. And rather as a corollary, or in a way that very much fits together with the first problem, Rawls's conception of power is too narrowly legalistic / moralistic. So let me explain these. And I should say, these are points that I think are recognized by philosophers in the black radical tradition like Shelby and Mills. I'm just bringing the point to the ideal theory, which is not something that they do. So take the conception of the basic structure, just to tell you what it is or remind you. So the basic structure is defined as comprising society's main political, social, and economic institutions and how they fit together in one unified system of social cooperation from one generation to the next. So you could have liberal socialism, you could have unbridled capitalism. Those would be different basic structures having to do with how things fit together. Importantly here, for my purpose, is the understanding of institution that Rawls is working with. So the basic structure has the basic institutions fitting together. Institution, he defines, and he defines this, I think, under the influence of H.L.A. Hart. He was at Oxford for a while and learned this from Hart, or took this up from Hart, that an institution is a public system of rules which defines offices and positions with their rights and duties, powers and immunities, and the like. And some of you will hear the Hofeldian resonance there, which I'll come to later. So this is a legalistic conception of the basic structure of society with these public systems of rules. And this legalism of the definition is compounded by how the basic structure will get elaborated, or how Rawls talks about what its role would be in an ideal society, and how in an ideal society it would get elaborated, involving a certain kind of regulative primacy over other layers of society. The basic structure and the principles governing it be primary over other things. And he suggests a hypothetical process of thought that we could go through if we want to think how this would work out concretely. To imagine that, he suggests, well, you could imagine you got the principles, they're satisfied. You can imagine there was a constitutional convention which made things a bit more concrete, and took into account, so his hypothetical choice situation, which picks the principles, has a veil of ignorance about any particularities of a society, but the Constitutional Convention would need some of those particularities to do its work. Then comes the legislature, which will need a fuller, even fuller knowledge of the particularities of the situation to go on, and then adjudication coming most concretely in the particular. So the regulative primacy, the way that's thought of, is that the principles are completely governing, and each layer has to be governed by and comport with what's decided at the previous layers. So it's a nicely sort of legalistic picture that fits, and I think many have remarked on the way in which this fits sort of the U.S. system with the legislature, and even the administrative agencies could be thought to have a position in that set of tiers. I'm going to skip the family. The other defect has to do with the conception of power in Rawls. And I reviewed all the instances of the term in the theory of justice and found as many as I could in the other works. And I set aside the ones having to do with individual psychological powers to form a conception of the good. There's a little bit of appearance of what I think of as a Hobbesian conception of power, where that has to do with your having resources that enable you to get what you want, so the arms or the friends or connections or whatever those resources are. That registers really in Rawls's principles only in the case of the one exception. So his liberties are a list of liberties, the various basic liberties on the list, and the only one he insists on there being fair value of, which means that you have the resources to get, a decent amount out of the liberty. The only guarantee of fair value he thinks is defensible is for the political liberties, the liberties to participate in politics. Otherwise, overwhelmingly, the instances of the term power that are social power in Rawls are Hofeldian in the way that I signaled earlier, that it has to do with normative powers. He's talking about, the paradigm example that keeps recurring is the powers of the legislature to pass laws. What kind of power is that? That's a normative power. They're authorized. The legislature is authorized to pass laws, and then lots of philosophical puzzles as to what that normative authorization amounts to, but that's not the point. The point is that it is a normative, moralized notion of power, and that notion of power is just too narrow to cover the issues of oppression that we're worried about here. It omits, except in this special case of the fair value of political liberties, it omits the obvious Hobbesian power where you can get disparities of wealth, disparities of connections, and so on, contributing to people's or groups' divergence of power. And so there's the Hobbesian stuff left out, also the informal social norms left out. And as I tried to say in going over the US history, what's kept racism alive in the United States and the racist discrimination alive in the United States has been the informal norms. The law is pretty good as far as it goes. It could be better, but it's pretty good. It's the informal norms where the racism lives on. And this is a point that's been well made by Charles Mills, Aaron Kelly, and Jerry Cohen, among others. All right, so I don't know if there are, how many Rawlsians there may be in this audience. A Rawlsian might object to say, well, look, the principle of fair equality of opportunity is going to take care of all this stuff in the ideal Rawlsian society, because principle of fair opportunity says, fair equality of opportunity says there must be equal chances for those with equal natural talent, right? And now it's true that differential group power will undercut getting to that result. Therefore, the basic structure of society must be set up to block differential group power. And so it'll take care of the problem in the ideal society of justice and fairness. My answer to that is that it doesn't take the focus on the basic structure of society seriously enough. The principles govern only the basic structure. That was the point of the four-stage sequence. You get beyond the basic structure by going to the other layers. But the principles govern only the basic structure, and those don't register the effect of informal social norms on how things work out for people. So it implies only that you get this equal chances insofar as that's manipulable or changeable by the basic structure itself, and that doesn't take you all the way. And it's, you know, Rawls, his quote from Rawls where he says, yeah, the principle of fair equality of opportunity is supposed to work in the background, which is what the basic structure is the background of what goes on. It's not supposed to be intervening in the micro. So how am I doing? Okay. So I want to give you a model case of how the suppression might arise, just to help you think about it. I can't say concretely, but a little bit more definitely about what I'm worried about. So Rawls's difference principle, as you may know, it allows for inequalities of wealth and income as long as those inequalities in the big picture were down to the benefit of the least well off. So the least well off are going up, but there still could be, you know, inequalities. So you have inequalities, and it's those with natural talent get the chances at education. So you imagine you've got, and those who get the good education can get more income, and they need to get more pay to be incentivized to work. So you can imagine that an elite, maybe they went to the same schools, bonding with each other through their schooling and forming a group that's bonded by their elite training and their wealth, getting together and hoarding cultural capital, as it were, where the easiest way to do that is just the sense of connections, is the social capital, I mean, and magnifying their power and advantage that comes from the education and wealth with the cultural power. And then there'll be a second stage where, predictably, certainly if Max Weber's right, you know, people with extra advantages in society always have an urge to come up with a story, an ideology, a myth that will rationalize why they're in this good position, and that will tend to explain why they're the superior people or why the other people are inferior. And that could well breed animus within the society. They'll look down on the others or take airs on themselves, either way breeding resentment. And the oppression as such would arise rationalized or pressed on by this ideology when the group that's hoarded this power flexes its muscles and does things to exclude or lessen the chances of the more vulnerable and the less advantaged. And again, so these other kinds of capital, just to hit the point again, is that these other forms of capital, which are outside the economic and political, are not covered by Rawls's view. He's not regulating these informal things. And so people will be denigrated, marginalized, undercutting self-respect, which is something that Rawls would regret. All right. And this would undercut the well-orderedness of the society, but don't think that that's contra to the hypothesis. The hypothesis was you started with a well-ordered society, and that's my point, is that it degrades into one that isn't well-ordered anymore because of the bigoted oppression that could arise within it. Made that point already, that he's not covering these other dimensions, and it will become disordered even by Rawls's original principles because of inequalities that arise beyond what the difference principle would allow, predictably. And if that's right, just as a corollary, if the point that even by Rawls's own principles would be seen as unjust, this result, then maybe you really can't start with the assumption that any society well-ordered by Rawls's principles is going to be free of structural injustice, because maybe it could just start that way. Okay, so I come to my tentative attempt to be constructive. I am a Rawls student, and I want to think about how it can be made better. But it's a tough task, and I only have some tentative thoughts. Again, I think it's important to repair the ideal theory rather than just giving up on it and say, oh, well, I'll just do corrective or reparative justice instead. Those corrective and reparative justice need to be done, need to be thought about, and need to be implemented. But I think the ideal theory is important, as I've already said. So the aim is to make the ideal theory more resistant to this arising of bigoted oppression. But I think even if the attempt to repair doesn't fully succeed, the trying can provide interesting ways to think about oppression across a wide range of societies, given the degree of universalism of Rawls's view, and even more directly help us think about fighting oppression here and now, to think about what would need to be done to fix Rawls's view. Let's skip the other point. So I think, as I was thinking about what could be done, I think the main thing to be done is to not just declare that the social norms must be good, right? You declare that there must be an end to bigoted social norms. That's an empty ought. Useless. Instead, at least since I was thinking along the lines of my model case, what needs to be done is to figure out what can be added to Rawls's theory to make it less likely that subgroups will gain dominance of the troublesome kind. To focus my efforts, I am accepting a concession that Charles Mills made, at least at one point in his writing, saying that he thought Rawls did okay as far as the economic and political dimensions of things go. So I'm going to be focusing on other dimensions and taking three illustrative types of repair that might be considered. There's the core repair, which is to fix the notions of the basic structure and fix the conception of power that's at work. And then one could get at work on the principles, see if there are principles to be added. And primary goods, this is another technical Rawlsian notion. So the parties in the hypothetical original position who are choosing principles, what are their motivations? Rawls says, well, we will define them as being motivated to seek primary goods, which are the goods that citizens, as free and equal citizens, need to function as free and equal citizens. So we might add one or two more of those. All right, so core stuff first, reforming the basic structure. I have a very simple proposal, is one should change out Rawls's conception of the basic structure for Charles Mills's. Was Charles Mills put his basic structure idea forward to talk about the real basic structure, but he meant, the one that's the real unjust one that we're living under. But abstracting from the injustice, the dimensions are really useful. Keep the economic and political dimensions, of course. The somatic dimension, very important for someone thinking about racism, but also disability, is the dimension of the body and how it's understood and related to in society. There's an epistemic dimension. Miranda Fricker has really put this on the map for philosophers, not just the arrangement of knowledge and its pursuit, but how credibility is allocated to individuals. Is it allocated in a prejudiced way or not? Typically, there's a lot of that. The cultural dimension I've already referred to with the connections, but more broadly, systems of meaning and understanding. And what Mills calls the ontological dimension, which is the dimension involving the social construction of the idea of a person, which is central and which the history of slavery showed. You had to pay attention to that. Okay, so that's the proposed change in the basic structure idea. What about power? I think we can build on this Mills conception of the basic structure to fill out the dimensions of power that need to be added. We have the economic capital, goes with the economic sphere, epistemic capital, in terms of knowledge and established credibility that is accumulated, social capital, status and connections, cultural capital, secured memories and thriving tradition, and ontological capital, which I'll be elaborating beyond the social bases of self-respect in a moment. Okay, so those are the core issues and some, sketch suggestions about how to deal with revising the roles. What about the principles? I'm just going to take an example of principles pertaining to the body, how better to pick up the somatic dimension within Rawls's view. It's important because we just know from history that oppression of this bigoted kind has really been inscribed in the bodies. Think of Frantz Fanon's work on the black body. I want to make a terminological distinction just for the sake of brevity down the line. So we know the idea of disabilities, and we recognize now that there are bodily traits or conditions that, given the socially built environment we've got, make it physically impossible for people to do certain things, okay? But I think there's a parallel notion at that same level of abstraction, which I want to label disfavorednesses, which are bodily traits or conditions of a person that, given prevailing social attitudes and norms, make it socially impossible or very difficult for that person to do things or live in certain ways. So there's been a lot of attention with disability to the built environment, physical environment, but we need to complement that with looking at the social environment. And we can use these ideas now to alter the principle of equal basic liberty, or at least put a gloss on it. So it's securing the basic liberties to all, and that should be read as securing it to all, irrespective of their disabilities or disfavorednesses. Now, given Rawls' setup where the principles that you end up with are ones that are chosen in the original position, for things to come out that way from the original position, a change needs to be registered in the original position. And this is Rawls's reflective equilibrium procedure, right? Just go back and forth between what you want to get out of it and what you put into the original position. So I would drop from the original position, actually, the simplifying assumption that Rawls uses just to postpone things, and say, no, actually, there are seriously disabled people in the society. And I would extend the veil of ignorance explicitly to cover the disabilities, and the parties don't know about the disabilities or disfavorednesses of the people on whose behalf they're choosing, and so they'll be impartial vis-a-vis all that stuff. And then hopefully things will come out more fairly in that regard. Also, in this continuing the somatic dimension, I want to talk about a possible alteration of the principle of fair equality of opportunity, or again, an explanatory gloss, which says that, requires that the law, insofar as it affects people's opportunities, reasonably regulates the built environment with regard to disabilities, and enforces protections against stigmatization that might come from either disability or disfavoredness in the somatic realm. Finally, a proposed additional primary good, and this gets to back to the ontological dimension, having to do with personhood. So when you have this epistemic concern with credibility and people, the groups whose members are systematically have their utterances disbelieved or discounted, so their credibility is undercut by prejudice, that their self-respect will predictably suffer in a way that Rawls's treatment of self-respect doesn't capture. Rawls has a beautiful treatment of self-respect, but it's all framed in terms of actions. So self-respect for Rawls is sustained by equal basic liberty of action and by being aware that one is cooperating mutually with others. Again, matter of action. Whereas here, in the epistemic dimension, we're talking about people's relationship to discourse. And that's another dimension of what contributes to people standing as persons that isn't captured by the action-related aspect of self-respect that Rawls treats. So if you didn't have Rawls's work, you could have just broadened the term self-respect, but I'm letting him have the narrow term self-respect and saying that you should add this additional primary good to complement, to get the other side of what's needed for people's secure standing as persons, which would be having the social bases of unprejudiced credibility. You can't distribute the credibility itself, but you can provide the social background that would help distribute it justly. So it complements the social basis of self-respect. Again, well, here there's an interaction with the other apparatus of the view in terms of the principles and their selection. It would be useless to add a primary good if you didn't have a principle that responded to it, so you've got to add a principle. The fair equality of opportunity principle will do something in this regard because it supports education, which was going to lessen probably the prejudices along this line, but it won't zero it out. So I think a broader and stronger response to this primary good that will better address our issue about bigoted oppression arising would be to insist on adding a fair value guarantee to one more basic liberty, namely the freedom of speech, and say that people should get sort of the fair value of their freedom of speech. They should have the resources, in this case the epistemic resources, the credibility resources they need to be treated as real partners in discourse. So in conclusion, I think even if it doesn't work, the reasons to try to make Rawls's ideal theory better, I've explained why it's in need of repair. The question about, I'm tentative about whether these amendments really improve Rawls's theory. I think they would make Rawls's ideal theory more proof against new bigoted oppression arising. And I think they're not obviously at odds with Rawls's liberalism, although we can discuss that, and people may have questions on that. But they certainly add more complexity and controversy to a view that's not without controversy and complexity already. And they would need to be filled out and more integrated into the view. So that would be a lot of work, but I think even such an effort at repair can indirectly help us intellectually to think more systematically about a wide range of oppressions and how they work, and to come up with better ways to fight oppression here and now. Again, not to denigrate the work being done under the heading of non-ideal theory, but it's complementary, I think. And I'm sure that other people will come along and have better ideas about how to repair Rawls's theory in this regard than I have. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry, for this inspiring talk. I think that Rawls would have liked it because it was presented in the same modesty which was characteristic for John Rawls, and using Rawls' ideas in order to repair some of the deficits which show up in recent conflicts. But now the floor is open for discussion, and because we started 10 minutes late, I think we have now 15 minutes time for discussion. This is not very much, so please be brief in your questions and answers. You were first, and then I take.
Thank you so much for your great talk. I agree with you all of the topics, but maybe some points I don't agree. I would like to ask a question about Rawls' individualistic approach. If we move on individualistic approach, only we can solve or we can make suggestion about structural injustice, not only structural injustice, even in epistemic injustice, because young moves on social, we are social beings, or Fricker moves on, we are relational beings. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Sure. I know that lots of people do take Rawls to be individualist. Some of that is misreading the role of the original position, where the hypothetical parties in this hypothetical choice situation are defined as caring only about their own shares of good. But the point of that is to have the functional equivalent of benevolence, because you combine that self-interestedness with not caring about other people of the parties with their being under the veil, so they don't know which person they're going to be, which makes them fully impartial. And then, so if you look at the content of Rawls's view, first of all, you have the subject of the view, the subject matter is the basic structure of society. So it's a structural, society-wide topic that he's talking about to begin with. He's not talking about individual interaction. He's talking about how the society should be structured. And he also, and this, I had the sort of the honor, but also very awkward situation when Michael Sandel's book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, came out and sort of attacked the lack of community in Rawls. I had the position of presenting that book in Rawls's seminar, and I did my best to give a charitable reinterpretation of it, and that was not well received. But, and I think it was sort of appropriately not well received, because one of the things about that communitarian critique, just to take an example of a non-individualistic view, is that it was deaf to the beautiful articulation of the idea of community that comes at the end of a theory of justice. So anyway, I think Rawls is very sensitive to the social and the community. He also is defending individual rights, so he remains a liberal, but he's a liberal who folds in. I think he's got, it's too bad we didn't have a Hegelian keynoter, but I've talked elsewhere about Rawls really picking up on the Hegelian idea of Sittlichkeit. So anyway, longer conversation, but I would defend Rawls on this point is the short answer.
So you are the
as not being an individualist in an era, yeah.
Please say your name.
Yes,
So
hi, my name is Luana. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Firstly, I would like to ask about the disfavoredness. This is the first time I see this. I didn't understand if the disfavoredness would come as a basic knowledge of the parties in the original position, or if it would be something like the correction of undeserved inequalities as in parallel to the difference principle. So what is exactly the role of this disfavoredness? Because I understand this is an original idea. Secondly, when you consider that barriers or the state of society should be taken into account, or the basic injustice of the structure of society should be taken into account, in the first stage, how ideal this still remains, as ideal theory is supposedly it's supposedly to be known as ahistorical. So if we have to include a historical aspect of it, which is how society it is nowadays, how ideal is it still? And thirdly, You follow the path of Eurasians to make adjustments on the original position, and as I think I could see, one of the adjustments you make is in the reciprocity, but reciprocity has been very fundamental to the contractarian aspect of the theory. So how contractarian would your proposal of reformal would still be if we drop down the reciprocity assumption, for example, to include disfavoredness, as you mentioned. So to sum up, the questions are how ideal is it still your proposal, and how contractarian, how faithful it is to the contractarian foundations of Rawls theory in that sense.
Right, good. And you also have the disfavoredness bit, and I just made up that term, but the role of that and the role of disability that I was suggesting in parallel is just as a factual assumption that the parties are allowed to make. So in Rawls's theory as it stands, he has the parties in the original position, who are the hypothetical constructors, assume that there are no seriously disabled people. So just reverse that. And then they should also, there are also, as it happens, disfavored people. And so they should assume, I mean, they're talking about human societies in general, they should assume that this kind of disfavoredness is certainly a possibility for what can happen in a society. So it's just a factual assumption for the parties to take on board. And on the question about ideal and non-ideal, I really am sticking with the ideal theory. So, so as in the case of Rawls himself, you need to distinguish between the point of view of the philosopher, in this case me, and the setup and the principles. So I'm moved in what I'm doing. I'm modifying Rawls's theory based on my worry about vulnerability to oppression, right? But it's going to still be an ideal theory. We're talking about what an ideal society would be still. You're just going to have, it's going to have different content because of different principles shaping it and so on. But there's no, it's going to keep the assumption that we're going to end up with a well-ordered society. It's going to have a different content to it, hopefully more robustly protected against new forms of oppression arising in it. And then you're right that well, especially adding in the severely disabled is going to mean that there's less economic reciprocity. I think that's okay. And I defended that at length in response to Martha Nussbaum earlier. I just think, yeah, and well, anyway, there'd be a longer textual discussion about how much Rawls depends on this reciprocity idea for his arguments, and so would you have to fix his arguments, but we'd have to discuss that later. Thank you, though.
You're on the next one.
Thank you. You emphasized a very important point, which is the significance of the bodily features and traits, and you suggested repairing certain features or aspects of Rawls' philosophy at different levels. One of these levels is the original position, and you suggested to modify the original position in order to include these very important aspects. Mm-hmm. Now, in my view, to my knowledge, the original position already sets aside all individual aspects as well as all aspects pertaining to collective belongings, group belongings. So among them there certainly are prejudices related to these bodily aspects, disfavoredness and disabilities, as well as all individual aspects. When I have to think in accordance with if I put myself in the original position, I have to put aside my individual characteristics, etc. So what is new in your suggestion?
Yeah, good. I think you're basically right about that in principle, that's why I was using the term explanatory gloss. So what I'm saying about disabilities and disfavoredness is a little bit like what Rawls says, I think is in Political Liberalism, that gives the story of Saul's conversion to Paul on the road to Damascus, and says, look, we have as a considered judgment and endoxon that we now do, that he's got the same political rights, should have the same political rights before and after the conversion. And so that's a reason why he says the veil of ignorance should cover people's own particular conception of the good. So the parties don't know their own conception of the good, they don't know better put, they don't know the conception of good of the persons they're representing. And so instead they act on the basis of the theory of primary goods, which is attributed to them. So it's just something worth spelling out as to why the veil has the content that it does, and that it's really important to have the veil apply now to the bodily stuff with regard to disabilities and disfavorednesses, because it's a really important issue and we want to emphasize that. So to emphasize that, well, at least you can start by spelling it out as an explanatory gloss, and then I don't have a story yet about Saul, parallel to the Saul and Paul story that's as catchy as that, but that would be anyway, the point is just for emphasis. So I think you're right in principle about that. It's already covered, but worth spelling out.
So if you agree, Henry, I would like to collect two questions in a pair, and so you are the next one.
My name is Sylwia Wojtczak. I'm from Poland, from the University of Łódź. And I would like to ask you about the ideas of redevelopment of Rawls' concept. Because when you propose to add to the dimensions, to Rawls' dimensions, like social and economic, such dimensions as epistemic or somatic, for me it's quite clear, because we know that it is better to know more than less, and it is better to be more healthy than less healthy. They are neutral from the values, from the point of view of axiology. But when you speak about cultural dimension, the problem is more complicated, and you endanger the theory of Rawls with some contradiction, because what do you mean by cultural dimension? There are many cultures which, for example, are not liberalistic, which treats some groups of people worse, and it is not very neutral from the axiological point of view. So you would have to favor some culture if you want to accept this cultural dimension. Isn't it a little bit dangerous for the theory? Thank you.
The next one is Matthias Malmann.
Thank you for the excellent and most interesting talk. My question is, what is the overall conclusion from your very plausible additions, amendments, corrections of Rawls theory? And one way to read what you propose is that it underlines that Rawls is not the fountain of all valuable thought and justice, but it's an interesting contribution to a long tradition of egalitarianism with a limited field of application, which doesn't diminish any of the importance of this book. And it perhaps, if we see the whole thing like this, it focuses on our attention on a very important background question, namely, what is the origin of this egalitarianism? So why do you actually want to correct Rawls? And that seems to point to principles that Rawls himself presupposes, which motivate him to create this expository device of the original position and the veil of ignorance. So, and in times where we are not talking about how to best apply equality, but how to defend the idea of equality, because there are unashamed racists around who make it the point of political victories to be unashamed, racist, unequalitarian, and so on. How do we make this point of equality? Is that not in a way the deep structure of your argument that we should talk about that?
Yeah, because Rawls was big on arguing that the arguments can go in all different directions, right? But so one of the great values of doing the non-ideal theory, the kind of critical non-ideal theory specifically that Charles Mills does, is to vividly put before us the horrors of the inequalities that have existed. So I don't think one needs to find a philosophical foundation. One can also work with the endoxa or the considered judgments in order to make the argument against inequality. In terms of the modifying of Rawls, which was taken up by both questions, I know a lot of people are getting tired of Rawls and time to move on and so all this stuff. But a great advantage of Rawls's theory is it's like a 1950s automobile. It's sort of transparently, you can change out the carburetor for a different carburetor. You yourself can tinker with it and change it around. Whereas the modern cars, they're all computerized and you can't get in there and do anything right with it. But Rawls has this nicely sort of transparent set of modules in the theory, the original position and the principle and so on. And so it's a theory that's easily tinkered with, which is a kind of plus, which says, yeah, it served its purpose, maybe whatever. I mean, you can all take all different attitudes towards that. And connecting with the question about culture, I find that a very difficult issue, and I'll tell you why, maybe probably from a somewhat surprising perspective. I've got a wonderful young colleague named Olufemi Taiwo, who's written a book called Reconsidering Reparations, and he's arguing that anyway, reparations needs to be a remaking of the world to undo the damage of colonialism. And he argues very strenuously that there's only one basic structure, and it's a global one. So that would, and I'm drawn to that. I haven't fully made up my mind on that topic, but that would complicate the cultural question if we should, as a revised Rawlsian, grappling with these issues of injustice, move to thinking about really the main subject matter being the basic structure of the globe. But I wasn't trying to, I hadn't gotten as far as trying to suggest any principles relating to culture itself. I mean, there are cases of what's known, again, following Miranda Fricker's work, as hermeneutical injustice, where cultures are discriminated against partly because they're starved of the resources they need to keep their cultures going, which is very much happening with the Native American cultures in the United States. So there are cases of clear injustice. What full justice would require with regard to culture would be tough. I don't know that I'm taking that on necessarily as a burden, though, because I was looking at these different dimensions as dimensions of power, and the point is to not drop out of your principles that pertain to power any of the dimensions that seriously affect social power.
So now I would like to collect the last three questions. First one is Bertram Lumfeld.
Well, thank you. I was a little bit wondering why in your repair agenda there's no mentioning of the difference principle. Is this because there's no room left after going into the lexical order and the opportunity principle is fulfilled? And I'm not sure if this is really true. So if not, economic inequalities could favor also social and cultural capital to the less favored. But then that needs alteration in the favored terminology in the difference difference principle. And just a follow-up to the lady who stood before me, that would then bring something on the table which is, I think, is really complicated to have a measurement mean, a global measurement mean if you have your economics, namely money, for cultural and other forms of capital. And does that not also affect your opportunity or fair opportunity argumentation, that there is no central or global measurement of these cultural and social capital issues?
Right, good. That last is, oh, sorry.
I would like, the last two ones are on this side. Henry Spector is the next one.
Thank you. Congratulations on your presentation and on your effort for repairing Rawls' theory. I would like to hear a little bit more on how you are in the different levels, the ontological one. I have the feeling that knowing your work for the specifications, the immanent, the idea of principles, how to develop those. I'm also very interested, I already heard something on the cultural side, but I would like to hear a little more on the ontological. I think you did that too quickly into the passing on your presentation, so I think there has to be something more there. Thank you.
Okay. The last one is yours.
I'm a philosopher from Mexico.
The one in the black T-shirt. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Andy from Canada. I don't know if you've read Michael Polanyi, but he talks about something called the moral inversion, in which a society, in attempting to achieve a utopia, actualizes a dystopia. And I can't help but wonder if that is an implication of this idea of disfavored. I mean, that seems like a dangerously nebulous concept in which everyone could claim to be disfavored, and then could lead to like some sort of police state now that we have to police everyone to try to figure out who's disfavored and who's not, which actually also leads to the question of like what it gets to this ontological question of what's the norm then? What are we supposed to be saying is the favored position? Thank you.
So now it's your turn for the last answer.
So I like the idea of taking up the difference principle. I mean, that would be pretty obvious. My model case started from the group that was richer, and so you could tamp down that possibility. That would be a good way to shut that down. I'd have to rerun it with just the cultural power. But if you had the cultural power, that could still be a problem. But I like that, and I'll think about that more. To say more about the ontological development, I mean, partly what I would do is refer you to the wonderful work of Sally Haslanger on that. It was mainly a philosopher of language, but she's talked a lot about, built a theory about the social construction of the idea of persons and gendered persons, women, and so on, persons of certain race, based on implicit presuppositions of discourse and how they sneak in, terrible presuppositions, terrible in content, to wreak havoc on people's self-conceptions. So that, anyway, that's a good sort of theoretical place to go to fill that out. And on the moral inversion, I mean, I think Rawls says various things, and he says most explicitly at the beginning of Political Liberalism about the role of his theory. What is it trying to do? And he does talk about guiding action as being one of the roles, but another one of the roles is to help reconcile us to our situation, if our situation is at least good enough. But he's not putting out I don't think he's putting out, I'll get some pushback from someone here, not putting forward a program of action necessarily. He's not saying this is what you must do. It's how you must think about what a fully just society would be. And then you should be wise about how you go from those thoughts to what actions you propose, and be wary about the possibility of a moral inversion. I don't think that the disfavoredness idea is really that much more nebulous than the idea of disability. And there are lots of sort of nebulous ideas, sort of the idea of natural talent that Rawls works with fair equality of opportunity. There's a lot that could be disputed there and allow for problems there too. So you have to sort of, to think, if you're going to get an ideal theory, you have to think about how things would go if they went well. That's the idea of a well-ordered society. And then, and then to be wise in practice, you know things don't always go well. And so if you're going to put any of these ideas or be inspired in practice by these ideas, you better be careful. You're right. That's certainly true. But I don't think Rawls would disagree with that.
So thank you very much, Henry, for your inspiring presentation and for the discussion. And before we leave, and before we clap hands, before we leave, Mortimer Sellers would like to make an announcement, but at first we should thank Henry for his work.
Thank you.